wonderful to reconvene the Child Division Lecture Series. And I want to thank Manda Gatto, actually, for taking the lead in coordinating the series for the next year. So you now have a schedule. We can plan on it. And Manda, thank you. I know that took a lot of work and reaching out. And also for taking the first presentation.
Which no one wanted. I don't know why.
Well, we're glad to have you here. I want to encourage you to go back to your teams and share your experience from today's presentation, and also to do what you can to encourage other staff. Now that we have the schedule for the year, we should be able to plan ahead and have people participate in this training. Okay? Amanda, I'm going to turn it over to you and Robbie.
Good morning. I'm so excited. I know this is crazy. People think I'm crazy, but I love this lecture series. It was something that I always thought we should do here because there's so many people that are doing so many interesting things. And there's so many people that are doing so many things, and it's hard to plan a lecture series. But I think this year, gosh, please help me make it a success. It's planned through, I think, May or June. There's a list of all the, the flyers there for you to take, so please do. If you have any suggestions, you would love to present on a topic yourself. Maybe you're doing something unique around here and you want to talk about it. Or you have some training or something else, please let me know. And I imagine that it's possible that some presenters that are planned to be here, somebody might have a change of plans or a vacation or something that they weren't expecting or whatever. So we might be looking for replacements, and then we'll be planning for this in the summer for the next coming year. So wahoo! So welcome to the first Child Division lecture. I don't know why no one wanted to do this first presentation. It's a very exciting morning, and I just want to appreciate Robbie, because without Robbie, I don't know what would be happening right now. So we're going to be talking about supporting gender fluid and non-binary youth. This is like the advanced version of the training I did last season, because I think, and probably those of you who are working with kids, which I think is everyone, we're seeing a lot more kids who describe themselves as non-binary, and I feel like it's really exciting because in the world, even when I think about like parents, right, that I work with, they're like, okay, I understand, gay and lesbian kids, okay, got it. And then I was like, what, transgender? I don't understand what that is. Okay, so we've got a lot of parents who now understand, right, what it's like having a transgender child and what that means, and now people are like, what, non-binary? Oh my gosh, wait, it's the next thing I don't understand. So we're going to talk a little bit about the terminology to use when working with gender fluid and non-binary populations, including understanding what that even means. We'll talk about affirmative interventions, which will be similar to some of the interventions we talked about last year, including social, medical, and legal options for affirming gender expression, which is different in this population than it is in a population that might describe themselves as transgender, although as I say that, language becomes deconstructed because there are people who are non-binary who consider themselves transgender as well. So everything I say, I could qualify with something else. And then we'll talk about, as always, ways to contribute to a world that's safe and affirming for gender fluid and non-binary people. I have a few things out on the table. I wish I had enough for everyone. I recently went to a conference in Philadelphia. It was the Trans Health Conference run by the Mazzoni Center. If you have interest in this topic, I really recommend that conference. They have a lot of really interesting presenters and people from the community, right, who come and do workshops and things. It's a very in-depth learning experience, right? So you can really see a lot of things that you might not see in a presentation like this. So so I highly recommend that. So some of those materials came from that training. Like I said, I don't have enough for everybody. If you take a couple, maybe you can copy them. I'm sure they're copyrighted, so don't copy them, but use them in a way that is helpful. And also, at the very back, too, in addition to the list of Child Division lectures, there's another handout that will give you a little bit of this information, in a copy, a little copy of it. Before we go on, any questions, comments, anything anyone wants to share? All right, I'll be back with that. All right, so a lot of times when we have these conversations, the question comes up like, is this a new thing? I think in this room we're pretty clear, no, this is not a new thing. There have always been people who live outside of traditional gender roles. Although the compulsion to follow what's expected is strong. Whether we view people as even being transgender, right, depends on our cultural lens, so we all know about that. I personally think that increased opportunities for visibility and freedom in terms of, other aligned groups gaining more legal rights, right, in this country has been helpful in terms of creating an opening for people to be able to express, what might be a non-traditional identity. And who knows, right? There might be, in addition to cultural openness, there might be other hormonal or genetic influences that are beyond my scope, although there was a physician here a minute ago. I think we lost him, but perhaps now. Perhaps somebody else could speak to that. And so we discussed, for those of you who were at the lecture last year, we talked about this, right? I like to say, maybe not so long time ago. For some of us, it feels like a really long time ago. You were born and it was decided, right? It's a girl or it's a boy. And does anybody have children? Okay. Anybody thinking of having children? Not this week, but doesn't have children, maybe wants to have some. So for somebody who has children, could you say a little bit? So what's the import of it's a girl, it's a boy? Anyone? Want to share a parenting experience? Was it important?
What do you buy? What color do you put the room in? Like all of those things, it becomes like a major.
There's a whole set of assumptions that clicks into place.
Yeah.
Right, a whole set of
I can
assumptions.
remember being told at the ultrasound that what we were dead certain was going to be a girl was a boy. And the world flips upside down.
Oh, there you go. Okay, so what happened? You had to.
My
All of
wife
a
looked at
sudden-
me and said, "Are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm good." She said, "What are you thinking?" I said, "I'm thinking about football at age 40." So the assumptions all click into place.
Oh, right. They all follow it, right? They all follow it. And I think too, depending on, it's a big deal. I mean, I'm not a parent, but in my witnessing of parents, parents having children, which I have a long lifetime of witnessing that. Not like witnessing it, but the rearing of children. It's a big thing, right? It's a boy, it's a girl. And I mean, I don't know about you, but I always want to know, if someone's having a baby, like, is it a boy, is it a girl? My sister-in-law, this will be on video, so I'm sure she'll love to hear this. When she first had my nephew, wanted to do like gender-neutral things, right? So we were like, okay, fine. So, so we ended up buying like, what do you buy for gender-neutral? It's like green and yellow? Why? I don't know. And not blue and pink though, just green and yellow. And it lasted for a little while, but it wasn't long before, he's like playing with trucks. Those were his favorite things. He gravitated towards the things. So in some way, there's a biological scenario that occurs at birth where a person is assigned a sex based on the appearance of their genitalia, right? And we call that, and in this discussion we're going to call that your sex assigned at birth, right? So it's like, it's okay, it's a boy, it's a girl. And so, for many people, right, their sex assigned at birth, does, the sort of, what was being described as like, sort of clicking in a set of assumptions also gets clicked in for that person, but it doesn't necessarily resonate, right? And for others it does. So that's one of the things to talk about in terms of this discussion. So there are 3 versions of this now. They each become, successively more complicated. So I'm going to start with this one because, I'll be honest, right? Because I'm going to recognize that I have some privilege even to be here having this conversation about a group of people to which I do not belong, right? My privilege is this one makes me the most comfortable. I can like understand it, right? The other versions of this I'll show you become, like I said, more complicated. But so we're looking at, and so we're all on the same page, and like I said, some of you may remember this from before, and if you don't, welcome. This is a fun little graphic, and you can use this with kids and families too, and it's very useful. It's friendly and color coordinated. So we're talking about gender identity today, which we understand is sort of resting in the brain. That's how you think about yourself in your head, right? It may also be the chemistry that comprises you, right? That influences how you interpret what that means. But for the most part, our sense of identity is in the head, in the brain. Gender expression, right, encompasses the entire gender-bred person. Right, so your gender expression is how you appear on the outside, right? I mean, also there are things on the inside that are influenced by gender expression, but for the most part, they're things about how you dress and act and behave and interact with people, right? I have a fairly feminine gender expression, right? Because these are things that you would expect a female to wear. Biological sex has to do, right, in this case we're talking about, biological sex has to do with those objectively measurable biological aspects of people, including organs and hormones, right, chromosomes, those types of things. And this is also on a continuum, right? Well, it's a questionable thing. It's something that many of us have always thought was on a continuum. In this representation, it describes it as a continuum. We'll break that apart in a second. But we're talking about biological sex, right? Female, male, or intersex, right? People who have some combination, right? Chromosomally or otherwise biologically of aspects that would be considered, right, applicable to both sexes. Or ambiguous genitalia, right? That doesn't represent necessarily a straight either one or the other. And then sexual orientation now, right, is a separate thing, has to do with sort of like who we love. And there's also a variety of sexual orientations or identities, more and more every day. If you watch Instagram, or look at Instagram or Tumblr, you'll see all teenagers are coming up with all different kinds of things these days. But really that sexual orientation has to do with who you're physically, right, spiritually, emotionally attracted to. And for a long time, it was considered, it was sort of, if you were a heterosexual person, so you were a cisgender male attracted to a cisgender female, right, you're heterosexual. But as things are changing, all these definitions, I think, start to kind of crumble a little bit, because you think about, perhaps a trans woman with a cisgender man, and that woman may consider herself heterosexual. So everything is not as simple as it used to be, which is awesome. Here's like the next version, right? It's Genderbread Person 2.0. It like notches it up. And tries to get away from the idea that any of these particular aspects are on a continuum between male, female, masculine, feminine, heterosexual, homosexual, and that they're each, right, trajectories that take place on their own, coming from a place of the absence of that thing. Are you with me? Right, so, and then there are all kinds of little variations in between. So we go from, right, agendered, non-gendered, to female, to womanness, to manness, right, gender expression, right, somebody who might be, you might have considered this person more or less androgynous on some level, right, and there's a trajectory towards masculine or feminine. Same with biological sex and same with attractions, right, so attracted to nobody all the way. So this really includes people on this spectrum, right, who may consider themselves as not having a gender or as asexual, right? So that takes us up another notch. And then there's one more. And I don't, like I said, I don't always use these, but kids like them because they can, it's deep, it goes deep. So this is basically the same thing. And it basically what this one does is sort of strips away the identification of what might be on this side, because the assumption is that it's not what's on the right. So, anywhere on a continuum of not particularly expressing either of these things to expressing, either of them. And again, like I said, that brings in an element of openness in terms of being able to be inclusive of people who might not consider themselves, right, as being a part of a binary, which is one of the things we're here to talk about. And that, and I myself have to like constantly work with myself because I'm used to a binary. That's what I knew. It's been really fun to deconstruct it, but it's hard sometimes because it's, those old ways of thinking still, are sort of still ingrained.
And it's interesting because we've had a lot of discussions recently as a clinical team about the distinction between gender identity and gender expression.
Right.
And how they can sometimes cause us to get tripped up over our own expectations with somebody. We have a couple of students that are genderqueer, and one of them is identifying as a male to female, but androgynous in terms of gender expression.
Right.
Right? So the question then becomes is, are they confused? Are they unsure? And no, their isness, they know that they're female, right? But in terms of expression, that androgyny, that's something that's completely separate, right?
Right.
So it's fascinating to kind of take that apart and see how that interacts with our own expectations of what does this look like when somebody is in transition, right? Or
That
when
is
somebody's transgender.
Beautiful, absolutely, because you're absolutely right. And I think actually with, in work I've done with groups, right, so I spent about 3 years running a support group for trans and gender nonconforming kids and their parents. And I ran the teen, I oversaw the program, but I ran the teen group. So kids would talk about that actually, right?
Mm-hmm.
That someone might say to that kid, it's like, what I've now come to think of is like gender policing.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of like, hey, so-and-so, like, if you really wanted to be a girl, how come you're not wearing makeup? Or how come you don't dress more feminine? Or how come you're not doing this? Or how come you're not doing that? It's like a real misunderstanding of, right, like the person's identity, which is, I feel like I'm this kind of girl, right? Not the kind of girl you expect a girl maybe to be, or how you would expect someone to look. So, and I think there's a lot of pressure in some ways, and we could talk about this a little bit later too. There is a safety in conformity.
Mm-hmm.
It's stifling in some ways too, but there is a safety. So I think, those folks in a way, I think stand out sometimes and bear the burden, right, of a lack of understanding.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how our own experience of that person's external qualities, right, the way, as you say, like they can kind of comport themselves, how we interpret that, right?
Right.
And our own dissonance with it.
That's right.
If I showed up in a three-piece suit every day, I still am female. I know that I'm female.
That's right, yeah.
But for some reason, it doesn't jive with us when we're experiencing that.
Right, well, it kind of throws us off a little bit, right? Because, I'm a big fan of schemas, right? It just like doesn't fit with what we expect to see. And I think, many of us, I think you are, many people who can come to a lecture like this, and certainly me, we're like trying to break that down, even for ourselves as professionals, right? And think like, oh, how interesting that I would think, that I would have that reaction to a person. And it's in a way so much easier and liberating to just step back and let people define themselves. And all we have to do is just figure out how to follow next to them, But that part of our brain is always like, but this, but which, So I think we're good with this terminology, right, in terms of understanding gender identity. Transgender is a person who is transgender is someone whose biological sex doesn't correspond with their concept of their gender identity. This is a wide umbrella term, right? So it also may encompass some people who consider themselves non-binary. Transsexual is a term that's not used as often, and it's more of a medical term. And then intersex, right, refers to a variety of conditions that might create a situation where a person's, not easily identified by either category in terms of their ambiguity of their genitalia. So, in terms of this, I used the word cisgender before, so that's a term that's being used to describe people whose experience of their gender agrees with the sex they were assigned at birth, so people who are not transgender. Sex assigned at birth, right, I described before, has to do with a person's biological characteristics that are observed at birth and create an assignment of sex. And then, FTM is an abbreviation used to describe a person who's transgender and identifies, was assigned female at birth and is transitioning to male. And MTF is the opposite, right? A person who was assigned male at birth and who's transitioning to female. Right, transition has to do with the process of moving, right, from identification with one gender to the other, except that, and that for a lot of non-binary people, there are some aspects of transition that occur, and there are some aspects of transition that might not occur. Right, we're familiar with passing, which is controversial, has to do with being seen as the gender you're presenting, rather than being identified as your birth sex. Which is controversial, right? There's a privilege to passing because you don't have to deal with a lot of, right? There's a privilege to not being identified, right, when you're out in public, in some ways for some people. Stealth is an expression I hear a lot of kids use. Has to do with keeping that identity, that transgender status private from other people. Genderqueer. So Jen mentioned the term genderqueer. has to, right, is a sort of like a combo term. Describes people who don't necessarily identify with conventional gender categories, or who, it says transgress distinctions, but I like to think of it as transcend expectations of gender on a continuum of male to female, and also have some kind of sexuality piece to it, right, which is how the queer piece gets pulled in. So they also describe themselves perhaps as having like an LGB identity, which again falls apart when we start thinking about things like gender. But I said to my spouse this morning, so I'm married to a woman, she's genderqueer, she wears a suit to work every day and a bow tie. This morning I was like, I don't know, before you go to work, should I take a picture of you in my presentation? This is a genderqueer person. And people who are genderqueer don't necessarily identify as transgender either. So there's that piece as well. And coming out we're familiar with, right? It describes the process of sharing one's identity. These are some typical sexuality terms. And then we get to the good stuff, right? So we sort of, right, we're all clear what the binary is now, and the continuum that some of us are comfortable with, but that many people feel fails to represent them, between male and female. So someone who's non-binary, right, is somebody who really describes themselves as falling outside of that traditional binary, sometimes abbreviated as NB or just pronounced, right, as NB. And similarly to somebody who's gender fluid, they might they describe themselves maybe as a person who feels like a mix of two genders, right, or who feels some ways more often than others. So there's a combination of gender expressions and experiences that person has that they feel falls outside of a continuum on a binary. And the binary is a limiting. It's like any label, I think, but it can be it can be nice, right, to find your people in terms of a binary. It can also be limiting because you only can be this one thing or this other thing, and there's not a whole our culture is not that comfortable with the middle piece, right, where people have gender expressions that don't quite fit with what's expected. So that sort of explains a little bit about the non-binary, right? And people, each individual experiences that differently. So that's the other part of it. And then people who are gender fluid, right, are people who are perhaps non-binary, but whose experience of themselves in terms of gender is somewhat shifting, right? So it's fluid. They might feel like a mix of the two traditional genders. They might feel one more than the other. They might feel another gender at other times. They might experience themselves as a gender that's not even something that's described, by the binary terms, right? Something outside of that. The new what is it? A suffix? Pan. Right? So we've been hearing a lot about this over the last couple of years, especially with young people. Pansexual, pangender. It's kind of clever, I have to say. What's pansexual? Pansexual is like postmodern bisexuality, right? It's like the bisexuality that calls into question all the things you would have thought in terms of easily understanding what bisexual meant, right? So typically bisexuality describes, if a person's bisexual, they're attracted to both sexes, which is a binary. If you're pansexual, right, you're a person who's attracted to people without regard to necessarily their sex, right? Or with, including a variety of different configurations that might not be represented by the binary. So pangender is the same thing, right? Somebody who experiences themselves as being comprised of many genders. And then transfeminine, right, describes somebody who's assigned male at birth but identifies with femininity. It's an adjective, right? Transmasculine describes folks who are assigned female at birth but who identify with masculinity. So those are sort of like adjectives that might be useful. So we've got this part, right? That for the purposes of this discussion, gender is a socially constructed concept. If you went to social work school, I don't have to even say any more about that. But But basically, right, our society, our culture creates, so this is outside of biological sex, right? This is gender. Your understanding of what maleness and femaleness means comes from our culture, right? So each society and culture creates its own expectations of what gender roles are comprised of, and those roles are kind of imposed upon people, right, as the most appropriate or ideal behavior for that particular sex, right? So you can think about all the things in our culture that men are expected to do and women are expected to do or not to do, and all these rules, right, come from our sort of socio-cultural construction of the meaning of femaleness or maleness. And it's further created and enforced by our interactions with people in the social context from very early on. I mean, I don't know, does anybody know any 3-year-old girls? Have you ever known a 3-year-old girl? Like, what are they doing? What do they play? Dolls. Princess dresses? Does anybody have a princess dress? I mean, it's like...
Star Wars.
Yeah, Star Wars. If they're awesome, Star Wars. Right? But like, that's the thing. You know, I don't know how it happened. My niece wanted princess dresses. She'd never even seen them before. I don't even know how it happened. And so the social learning is very ingrained, right? It's there deeply. And, you know, we get those messages about what girls are supposed to do and what boys are supposed to do. And what happens when people live outside those lines? I mean, sometimes, right, in some, you know, maybe in this room, right, for people who, you know, if you had a daughter who wanted to play with trucks or a son who wanted to play with dolls, maybe you could be flexible and let that happen. But a lot of times it's, you know, there's a negative response when people want to live outside those roles. And, you know, there's a lot of bias in terms of what people feel like they can expect, right? I can expect a woman wearing pants, but I can't expect a man, you know, I can't accept a man wearing a skirt, right? Because somehow that's a thing that can't happen. So, and if it does happen, you know, it could be dangerous actually, right? Especially in that circumstance, especially when it comes with men. When it comes to men expressing femininity, right, it's even more dangerous. So, you know, in addition to being something that kind of gets constructed by our social, you know, society, by our culture, and reinforced by interacting with other people and receiving messages and watching TV and playing with toys and God, I don't know, does anybody see that video recently about a little girl going on a rant about all the pink stuff at Toys R Us? I mean, you know, the pink aisles are over there and the fun toys are somewhere else. So weird. But also, right, so also there's a self-concept in terms of a person's own experience of their masculinity or femininity, right, which I imagine a variety of people have experienced, you know, in the room on your own in terms of, you know, thinking about yourself in terms of the expression of those aspects of your own gender identity. And so we're going to think about it as a spectrum, right, of varied experiences, not just one or the other thing. And it's more than just sex organs, right, and genes and biology. You know, gender doesn't necessarily equal sex assigned at birth. So we have some, so I mean, this is something that we probably don't need to review too closely in terms of what the expectations are of either people who are assigned male or female at birth. But let's throw some things out there anyway. So what are some of the things you're expected based on whether you were assigned male or female at birth? You can speak from your own experience or just generally.
Well, I'll share an experience actually from adulthood. So
Awesome.
at
Okay.
one point I was the executive director of an agency and mostly dressed how I do now, which is I never wear makeup. Sometimes I wear skirts, sometimes I wear pants, whatever. But we had this big gala thing, and so I actually did something different with my hair and had on a fancy dress and a little bit of makeup. And I had a number of people who were board members or volunteers think that it was their business to come up and tell me how much nicer I looked and more appropriately I was going out in public now, right, as a high-level professional, which just really floored me. But that's how strong it is, right, that people...
Right. It was like, oh, you're wearing makeup and you did your hair, but it's like,
Yeah.
finally.
Yeah.
Why took you so long? You look so nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, well, maybe I'm not really comfortable doing that every day. Maybe this is just a special occasion.
Yeah.
Right? And how awkward that people, right, don't recognize in some ways how intrusive that is,
Yeah.
right? And almost disrespectful to be like, oh, finally, Kathy, I'm so glad you finally started doing that. That's a great example. Other people have examples of what you should do, what you shouldn't do? Come on, it'll be fun. Don't be shy. Or people you know who've done things that don't fit? You've got to do it.
So I have boy-girl twins. And for me, it's always fun to watch how people choose to interact with them based on their gender,
Right.
Because I can't even tell you how many princess things have been put on my girl. And she doesn't really know princesses as much. Like, I mean, she likes some of them, but like, she's not like, that's not her big thing. And they get very loud, very aggressive with my boy and try to play and roughhouse and do the whole thing. And he's not that kid. He does not want to hear the yelling. He doesn't want a roughhouse. He likes other things instead. But so for me, it's just interesting because they are the same age, same family, same everything, and people just will automatically try to engage them in different things.
Right, make assumptions about how they are, and you know, where he's like, oh, mama, come on,
That's exactly what
all of a
it
sudden
is.
run around with her, it's like, oh, hey, maybe you could dress up and show
Delicate
her how
little
to look
flower
pretty.
that she is has to go over there, and it's so the opposite sometimes. It's the funniest thing. But yeah, that's just what people do.
That's a great example. And it's great that their kids are the same age too, so you can really see how people respond. And you know, and people just do, it just begins happening, right? You can barely realize it's going on. Joe, did you have a,
Yeah.
Joe?
Like growing up, I was raised by a single mom and my younger sister, and I guess that put me more in touch with emotions, and I was always seen as women were sensitive or crybaby if I expressed them.
Excellent, right? It's like everybody wants men to be sensitive, and then when men are sensitive, everyone's like, "Oh, come on, stop! You know, don't cry. Right? Shut up, be strong." Well, but like, actually having my feelings makes me stronger. So it's a trap also. And I think that's what happens, right? For the idea even that feelings or understanding how you feel is a more feminine attribute, right? Really puts people in a box like that. So yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good comment. And, and that the response that people give to you when you're outside those lines is like, oh my gosh, what's happening? And now then, does anybody else have anything else to share?
A lot of the kids that I've worked with, and I teach martial arts, so I have a lot of experience watching girls fight against these expectations as they go from 7 to 8 to 9 to 12 to 13. A lot of what kids tell me they deal with, or show me that they deal with, is not so much disapproval, but the lack of validation. So, oh, you do that. Silence. Silence can be much worse than disapproval when it's all you get.
Right. We're not getting any affirmation, right? You're not getting any validation. That's a good point. I mean, I think, it's like requires people to step outside their comfort zone in order to validate, right, something that might be connected to a gender expression that wasn't what we were expecting.
My son does travel soccer, and sometimes they play with girls. And I can see the panic in their eyes, because if they do better, then they're bullies beating up on the girls, but if they get pushed around and scored on, then they're not very good. So.
Right, and imagine I wonder if the experiences of the girls on the team, right, that they have to kind of prove themselves in some kind of a way. I don't know what. I don't play sports, but whatever sports people think, to be just as good. So there's a lot to think about in terms of the fit, right, between your name, what people call you, the pronouns people use to refer to you, how you're identified in public, and people call you ma'am or sir or miss. I don't know. Does anybody still get called miss? God bless you if you do. Maybe you used to be called miss and now you're called ma'am. That's very sad. There's a fit in terms of where you're allowed or expected to go and not allowed to go, right? In terms of rooms, dressing rooms. I mean, if you're a gender nonconforming female who shops in the men's section at Macy's, where do you go try on your clothes? Do you go to the men's dressing room? I mean, it's not an open dressing room, right? So you could probably do that. Do you take your clothes across the store, or maybe to another floor to go to the women's dressing room, right? So the things that you can do, you can't do, how connected you feel, right? How right it feels to be in your body, and how, you express and present yourself to the world, and then how the world responds to you, right? Whether you can really be seen for who you are, or there's a lot of misinterpretation. So, you know, it's a privilege to experience there's a fit between your gender and the way people see you. And then there are all these other intersections, right, in terms of overlapping identities, right? Everybody is not just one thing, we're all a bunch of different things. So in terms of gender, you know, in addition, right, we're also thinking about race, ethnicity, culture, the age of the person. You know, I think for young people, there's a whole different world than there is for people who are, you know, from an older generation. We're thinking about sometimes adults who are in marriages, right? Parents, families, you know, aspects of like class, socioeconomic status, religion, sexual orientation. So there are all these other aspects, right, that come into play when we're thinking about gender in the context of overlapping identities. All right, if there's a God, this will be a video, and you'll be able to hear it. We'll see what happens.
Are you a boy or a girl?
Is it he or she or they or what?
That's so in right now to be like #gender fluid.
Where do you shop, in the men's or the women's section?
Or unisex?
Unisex! That word needs to die!
So what's going on down there?
None of your business.
I have had this many times.
It's this fixation to know they have to know because what they see is unclear.
People don't even bother to ask me. They sort of forcibly tell me in the street, you've got this genitalia.
And they can just go along and walk past people in the street and just sort of tick off like...
Vagina, penis.
Vagina, penis,
I
and
feel
like...
less anxious now.
Your genitals have nothing to do with your gender anyway.
Those two organs don't identify your whole life, and they shouldn't.
That's so trendy right now. #gender fluid.
I can see this person.
I mean, look at this coat.
I'm just like hip and down with the kids, you know.
We may have struggled to find the identity to understand who and what we are, but this isn't a fad.
Non-binary is like a term that people can use where I don't want to identify as male or female.
I don't identify with having a gender because I found it really restrictive.
I think the main issue just comes from the idea of people thinking that they can explain your gender back to you. So it's like, I'm non-binary, they're like, oh no, you're trans.
It's complex. I don't know, some non-binary people identify as transgender, others don't.
I don't think it's more trendy now. I think our existence is actually being recognised.
Yeah, we're actually being spoken about.
It's reaching people who are going to be confused, like I was, and they're going to be upset and not know what's going on, and they're going to see that word and hopefully it'll mean something to them.
So like you see someone and you can relate to it and you're like, oh yeah, lol, that's me.
Yeah.
What toilet do you use?
I kind of find myself having a breakdown about that on the daily.
Whichever one I please.
Like the amount of times that I've gone into women's bathrooms and it's like, oh, this is the women's bathroom.
This woman in Mackie D's, McDonald's, like laughed at me and was like, ha ha ha, thought you were a man.
And I was literally dragged out of the club by them and was asked, do I carry a card to identify whether I am trans or I should be using that toilet?
I don't like to go in the male toilets at all because it's like I will be looked at, people think I'm a pervert.
I will use male toilets unless I feel unsafe.
I know that I definitely don't feel safe in a men's bathroom.
At the end of the day, a toilet is somewhere where you go and have a shit. So what does it matter what gender you are?
I saw this tweet once that was like, you know you all have gender neutral bathrooms in your house.
But were you born a man or a woman?
I mean, what is a man and what is a woman?
What kind of person?
You're assigned gender, you're assigned sex.
I wasn't born with a penis, so...
You can be a boy and you can like flowers.
They want to term all your behaviours as either like a feminine or a masculine.
You can be a girl and you can like cars.
Then determine which they think you're more strong in and put you in that box.
I know, what do you know? The comments on this video, there are only two genders. Oh, I identify as an attack helicopter.
That's not natural.
This isn't natural, let's be honest.
It literally is though. Like, what?
Is marriage natural? Like, have you ever seen two squirrels, like one in a suit, one in a white dress, like with a sparrow marrying them in the forest? No.
Non-binary identity has been existing since the beginning of time.
You see other societies and cultures out there and they don't have this very strict two-box rule.
In the Torah, there are like over 6 or 7 genders.
Like Native Americans had 4 genders.
I think it's India, there's third gender.
Because there are so many examples in the animal kingdom. Snails are hermaphrodites.
Male seahorses give birth to their children.
Clownfish change sex halfway through their life.
Yeah.
Which is a Finding Nemo sequel I'd like to see.
Is it he or she?
I mean, thank you for asking.
2 options, he or she. Babes.
But there's he and she, they, their, ze, their, fee as well.
It can be confusing for someone because they don't know what you're presenting as necessarily.
From about 6 feet away, they presume me to be female, and then they get closer and they're like, oh.
I went in one shop and they're like, okay, sir, yeah, we'll keep on to that, thank you, sir. I walk into another shop 10 minutes later and they're like, yes, madam, I can't fucking win.
If someone wants those pronouns used for them, then that's why it's important.
Any thought that I would be assumed female is like just the most uncomfortable feelings.
And also people do get pronouns wrong sometimes, but just correct yourself, and it's fine.
And people are like, oh no, but I actually really struggle changing pronouns because I've known you for a really long time. I'm like, yeah, imagine what it must be like to actually be a non-binary person.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like, you're struggling with grammar, I'm struggling with life.
Do you shop in the men's or women's section?
Both is good.
Both is good.
I don't understand why we're still saying this is a female piece of clothing or this is a male piece of clothing.
You have this whole store of all these wonderful things that you could open your mind to.
Sometimes I'll wear a crop top.
Some days I would play with Barbies and wear a fairy dress.
And sometimes I'll wear a suit.
Other days I'd be in a Thunderbirds costume.
But I'm not doing this for you, I'm doing this for me. This is my sort of armour and my portrayal of how I feel inside.
I remember from my 12th birthday I got Hulk boxer shorts off my mum and
That's beautiful.
I was a happy little queer.
Are you gay? Yes. Hell yeah.
Absolutely.
As soon as they see somebody who's slightly more feminine portraying, it's instantly, you're gay.
Sexuality, gender, completely different things.
It's not a thing where your identity and outward portraying image is connected to your sex or sexuality or anything like that.
You define the labels don't define you. So you can bring your own definition to whatever label.
On my forehead or something.
Yeah, I'm gonna get it on a fucking t-shirt.
But I don't get it!
Then learn!
That's okay. It's really okay to not understand.
Ain't hurting anyone.
You know, despite the fact that everybody's experience is different, it's just so refreshing to meet somebody else whose pronouns are also they and their.
Then actually having a label is really, really important.
Yeah. It creates a lot of solidarity too.
It's just a nice warm fuzzy feeling, isn't it?
I love queer people.
I love the queers.
Unfortunately, the whole time I was trying to figure out who was male and who was female.
Right, it happens. I'm so glad you said that. It's a compulsion, actually. It is. I'm so glad you said that. Did anybody else have that experience? Yeah. It's amazing, right? Your mind cannot let it go. It can, though, eventually. I can tell you that. I can say when I first started doing this work, and before that, my whole life before that, let's say it's been 15 years, all the way even before that, it would happen to me all the time. I would see people on the street, and I would just be like, are you male? Are you female? If I couldn't figure it out, you would look down, right? It's a compulsion to categorize. The longer I've been doing this and thinking about it and working with this population, the more I feel expansive around it. I don't care really. It doesn't even matter, right? It doesn't matter as much to me anymore. My mind is not constantly trying to put people in a category. But I'm really glad you said it because I think it's just a natural thing that happens. And for us, I think as clinicians, it trips us up a little bit, right? Because we can't help but, try to put a person in a box, even just so we can kind of understand and feel comfortable, right? Even the individual who said in the video, about people saying, I just don't understand, I can't get it, I can't change pronouns. It's like, well, imagine how it feels to be that person. So. It's a common experience, I think, that you just want to think, and that, as the video represents, I think, for many people, it's like, just if I know what genitals you have, then I know. Then I don't have to feel so confused about the ambiguity, right? But, right, most of us are clinicians for the most part, or at least engaged in clinical work, and so I think, we can deal with ambiguity in a lot of areas. This is a fundamental area. But I really appreciate you saying that. What else? Any other comments or reactions?
I was thinking too, which I didn't struggle, at times I was thinking male or female, but more of they were talking about when they go in a store and one person says she and then one person says he.
Right.
So, what is the appropriate way, because I don't know if it's necessarily appropriate to say, what pronoun do I use for you, you know?
If you're like a clerk in a store and you're greeting somebody.
Yeah, or
I
if
mean,
it's somebody that you don't know or you're not in this setting where it would make sense, you know, with adolescent use it, you know, it makes sense to say, how do I address you, but not like, I guess in a more public setting.
Right, in a more gendered way. Did you have a comment to go to that? Or was
Yeah, you run smack into places where society hasn't built anything for you to stand on. So what polite form of address do you use upon first meeting somebody?
Right.
You don't know them well enough to ask how they'd like to be addressed.
Right.
So a store, they meet 20,000 people a day. So you have to default back to good afternoon and smile and don't, train yourself not to use that trap that society has set.
Right.
It's really hard.
That's right. Which I think, right, depending on how people were trained in their upbringing in terms of politeness and whatever else can be challenging. But I think that's right. There's not a good, sort of neutral word for you in a polite form if I don't gender you. I think we can maybe step back from it though. That might, like on the adolescent unit we've dealt with, it used to happen more often where we would split the kids for activities, girls and boys. And schools do that, it's like ingrained. There's boys' locker rooms and girls' locker rooms and boys do these things and girls do this and we would do that too. And then, then we started working with this population of kids that, brought that into question, Then we were like, why don't we just not do it like that anymore? We'll count you off, 1s and 2s, or we'll make a green group and a blue group and we'll assign you, or we'll pick something else. People who have a birthday before June, go to this group, and people who have a birthday after June, go to that. There are ways to kind of modify, I think, and I think it's also, I think it's tricky to, to have, it's like like an evolving language. So it can be hard. But also, you bring up a good point, which is the experience of that person, right? It's a disintegrated experience of my identity. If everywhere I go, it's something else, right? Hello, ma'am, excuse me, sir. A person has to have a pretty strong sense of themselves to not, right, to be so, to be as impacted by that in terms of being in public, right? Because it's not practical always. I mean, certainly people might say, don't call me ma'am. But, a lot of those interactions are superficial, right? So it puts a person in a position themselves where they have to constantly be saying, don't, right? They have to constantly be correcting people. So I think we've basically covered this, right? People with non-binary identities are people whose gender falls outside of binary, right? And they might identify as neither male or female, man or woman, or as both, or some kind of combination. And some people identify, some non-binary people identify as transgender, and other people don't. So it really depends on the person. Some of the challenges we can talk about, we've been talking about actually in this discussion, right? Which is that the language hasn't quite caught up. And the research on non-binary people is relatively new, right? It's evolving. I mean, there was a recent, the National Center for Trans Equality put out a U.S. trans survey in 2015. It was published, I guess the data came out last year. And, like a good 40% of the people who answered that survey identified as non-binary. So, that's a new element for that survey to address in terms of people identifying that way. And the needs of non-binary people might be obscured in some ways because, if they're not able to be captured in a transgender population, they might be overlooked, right? Because there's not another easy way to gather folks, to be able to capture data about people's needs. Right, and also what we've been talking about too, another challenge is that many people experience frequently being misgendered, and inappropriate focus on body parts, right? Which we have to forgive ourselves for compulsively doing, and prevent maybe ourselves from sharing that with people that are non-binary or transgender who have a gender identity that we don't quite understand, especially if we're not having a sexual relationship with them. Because I don't know about you, but I don't really want to know about the body parts of any of the people in this room even, and I love all of you, and some of us are really close colleagues. But it's weird to thinking about that, and that sort of highlights, right, the aspect of, right, the boundary in terms of the boundary violation that would represent. And, you know, how it's something that, like I said, we may not be able to keep ourselves from doing because we're just people who like categorizing things. And if you're a person who really likes categorizing things, it's even harder. But there's always opportunities to practice mental flexibility. And I think the other part is that a lot of times non-binary identities are either not understood or disregarded. Like, it's just too much trouble. We can't be calling you they. I just don't understand why we're doing that. It's like hard for me to think about it, you know. And so sometimes we might just not even actually put the effort into it that's really necessary, right, in order for a person to really feel like they're being respected. You know, the other thing is that medical issues about medical mistrust, and this is sort of what I think connects to us in some ways, right, might impact people feeling comfortable seeking health care. And this is certainly true for, you know, transgender populations specifically. And, you know, to the experience of the person, right, you're often in a vulnerable position when you're visiting a healthcare provider. And a lot of times, you know, trans or gender expansive people end up having to explain a lot to their providers who are uninformed, which I think to some degree is not problematic, but then people feel discriminated against, or they're refused service, or they're rejected in some way, or made to feel uncomfortable, or even actually a small number of people are assaulted. So, I mean, like right in a medical context. So, you know, that's certainly a challenge that people face. And I think, you know, that's something that most of us can manage in some ways in this environment, right, by being here, being open and inclusive. And then we also have to think about the issue of transition, right, in terms of, you know, some people who are non-binary may still want to have aspects of a legal, medical, or social transition. Most likely social, right, because that includes the piece where you come out and share your identity. But some folks aren't, they're experiencing barriers to receiving, particularly to medical or surgical care, because they're not considered to be transgender according to conventional narratives or according to best practices, you know, documents that are available for that community. So, you know, it can be tricky, I think, for people to get that permission. And I would say, you know, the most common surgery likely for a non-binary individual is usually a top surgery, right? So some breast reduction or augmentation. And I think the other part of this that we're talking about too is that not fitting into that binary can result in discrimination, but also even worse, like decreased safety, right, and experience of violence. You know, like being afraid to use a public restroom. I mean, hopefully most of us don't have to use public restrooms ever or that often if we could possibly help it, because it's just too much to deal with at any level. But I mean, I'm not afraid to go into a women's room in public. I don't think anyone's going to anyone's going to misinterpret that I'm in the wrong room. I do accompany my spouse to public restrooms because women freak out. You know, they're like, like there was a sort of an example on the video, right? Someone's like, you know, they'll see her and be like, oh, and then look at the door. Like, oh, it's like, oh, I'm in the right place. You're the one who's not in the right place, and I'm there to be obnoxious because I can, because I have the privilege, right? I have this privilege. I could be like, hey, you don't have to tell, you know, she's uncomfortable, but I'm not uncomfortable. I'll tell you we're in the right place. But that's just ridiculous, right? And, you know, this is a person who's got somebody with them, right, who identifies as female, who doesn't have that problem. But to be, you know, to be like a trans woman, right, so you're assigned male at birth and you present as female, you're much safer in the women's room. Like, we'll take care of you, it's much safer. Not that men's rooms are so unsafe, I guess, but they're unsafe.
Try walking into one with a dress.
Well, in New York City, sometimes you have to do that. You know, it's like a female takeover of the men's room. You know, but so, what were you going to make a comment?
Yeah, I have a public restroom story. So, I was traveling to Florida with my family, my wife and 2 children, and we got rerouted on 95, and we're in the sticks of one of those southern states. And I had to go to the bathroom because, you know, I frequent public restrooms and up until this point.
Only when you have to, right?
Well, now, yeah. And I got out and, you know, nonchalantly walked into this place. It was a gas station, so we stopped and got gas and walked in and didn't realize it until I was, like, knee deep into the store. I had cargo shorts on and a t-shirt, and was doing my thing. And
You're like, I'm looking very casual
walked
Sunday.
into the bathroom, and every eye just turned on me, and I was like immediately like a safety issue.
Yeah.
I gotta get out of here. And my family's in the car, and I gotta go.
You're having like a normal family vacation, you're feeling like, wait.
It was a horrible experience. I was like, okay, I really don't have to go to the bathroom, and like little kids and adults and the whispering and the looking, and
Right.
it just was like,
You're like, oh my God.
yeah, turned right around. I got in the car. I'm like, we gotta go now. Like that was quite an experience.
Yeah, that's disturbing. And I think,
Yeah.
right, in certain,
Yeah.
certain places more so than others, right?
Correct.
But yeah, that experience of having people be like, huh?
Yeah.
And be like, hey everyone.
I just gotta go.
Yeah, you're like,
Go real fast.
yeah, it's like frightening. And I mean, it's very weird how we are about that actually too, right? It's like, when the whole issue came around about transgender people and which bathroom they used, there was a fear of, I guess the idea was that I can't imagine that this wouldn't have happened already if it was a thing, but that predators, and I guess in the form of trans women, were gonna, who are actually men, were gonna dress as women to gain access to the women's restroom. I mean, I don't think anyone has to go through all that.
So I actually have a weird sort of counterpoint to that, because I have 2 young daughters, so I frequently will bring them into the men's room, or I'll actually go into the women's room, depending upon just the mechanics of it. And I have never felt uncomfortable, or made me feel uncomfortable, even going into the women's room. There'll be women who come in, will see me, and they'll be like, oh, it's okay, you're with your daughter.
You're a dad.
It's almost like I can be identified, so sort of that I'm there can be identified, and it's like, okay, even though a woman actually going into a woman's restroom is a problem. But like me being there, it's not, actually.
That's really interesting. What do you make of it? Why do you think it isn't?
I think it's because I can be easily identified as a man who's there with his children, so there's a reason that I'm there, so that all of a sudden becomes safe. And actually, technically, it's probably less safe for me to be in there, in a way. But, maybe not. How do they know?
Yeah.
But
exactly.
it's sort of like, I'm probably easy, like, I'm a male, very clearly presents as male, and I'm there with my daughters, so that sort of, I guess, just for some reason, makes it very okay for me to be there.
Right, I bet you that makes all the difference, actually. Right, I mean, that you're a dad and you're there with your 2 daughters, that's easily explained, and most women and most people, right, even people who don't have children would understand. I don't know how old your daughters are, but,
6 and 4.
Yeah, little tiny girls, like you're not going to shuffle them off into the bathroom by themselves, right? So, yeah, you get...
Almost. I'm so looking forward to that.
So awesome.
So looking forward to that day.
You will never have to set foot in the women's room again. But yeah, you're right. But so in the context of your presence there, it's explainable to witnesses who might see you, and probably quite heartwarming in some, right, in some aspects. It's always nice to see parents, especially dads, taking care of their kids, because for some reason that's a rare event. I don't know.
That actually brought up with sort of gender expectations.
Right.
I get so much credit for that.
Right.
For just being like a normal parent, I get so much credit.
Like I do like a few things and I'm amazing. Yeah. Forget about that woman in my house who takes care of the all the rest of the time.
Nothing.
There was another comment over here. Yeah.
The issue, now that it's on people's radar, for generations, people have walked into the quote-unquote wrong bathroom, but they were passing, so no one cared.
That's right.
And the stall was private, so no one cared.
That's right. Yeah.
But if you walk into a bathroom and you're not clearly one gender or the other, to be ambiguous can be both dangerous and stressful.
Yeah, that's right. For the person, right? For the person, and feeling like there's not really any particularly comfortable place to go, right? Both places are uncomfortable.
I love the line from the video. Everybody has gender neutral bathrooms in their home.
Yeah.
Why do you think that's weird?
Right. It's like I don't know. There's like a throwback in a way, right? Like a puritanical aspect of our culture that I don't know, requires that separation. And I can tell you that when it's turned upside down, it's very weird. All the conferences I've gone to, all the trans health conferences, and by the way, there's one. First of all, there's a flyer on the table, which I only have one copy of, but everybody has a cell phone, so you can snap a picture of it. A GSA forum that's run by GLSEN, the Gay, Lesbian, and Straight Education Network. It's local, so if you guys have kids going to that, you think?
I don't know.
Maybe, you might. When is it? It's in November 3rd, I think, or November 18th? November 18th. It's at Montgomery High School, my alma mater. So there's another one. There's the Gender Conference East, I think, is November 3rd and 4th. I'll have to double check the dates for you. But that's a big conference that happens in Newark. So what I was going to say is, having attended a lot of these conferences, they always reappropriate the bathrooms to be gender neutral. Somewhere I have a picture in this slideshow of one of the signs. And so you don't actually know, it's in there somewhere. You don't actually know, like, speak about my mind wanting to categorize things. I don't actually know which bathroom I'm in, right? Because they're all the same. But I'm with female colleagues who haven't had that experience before, and we walk into a gender-neutral restroom. Like I said, I don't know which one it originally was, but there's a line of urinals on the wall. So of course we know it was a men's room, and she was like, oh gosh, like I don't want to see that. She was like, I was like, what, it's just a bathroom. We can all see all the things, right? All the fixtures are okay. And right, most of them are private. Like we're not using the restroom together. So ideally, there's a gender-neutral bathroom, right? So anybody can use it, and it doesn't matter. And people who don't necessarily fit easily into any category, to either category or to some categorizable label that we feel comfortable with, could use a restroom in peace and not have to worry about it. And I don't think all that nefarious stuff is actually happening. Robbie, could you move me on? I don't think all that nefarious stuff is really happening in restrooms. I think some nefarious things could happen depending on where you are. I don't recommend like Newark Penn Station as a place to hang out in the restroom. But like I said, gender neutral bathrooms or single service bathrooms can solve that problem. So then the next thing is about names and pronouns, right? So this is the other thing. So a lot of people, right, sometimes names are very gendered and sometimes they're not. So sometimes non-binary people don't identify with the name that they were given at birth, and might select their own name, or a name without, a more neutral name, a name that doesn't have those traditional associations. This is always a thing in my work with families that's like very significant. Like I said, I don't have any children, but you could be quite sure I would spend many, many hours choosing a name, and I would hope they would keep it forever. Right? It's like my gift to you at your birth. So it's very hard, I think, for a lot of parents when names are changed. And it's especially, I think, hard for parents when they find out, like on Facebook, or they find out, like they didn't, no conversation happened. It's just like, wait, all your friends are calling you Hunter now? Like, when did that happen? Why didn't you tell me? I've had some success with parents accepting a new name when they give it. So I've had some kids who are in the early stages of kind of discovering this and can talk to their parents, and their parents can come around to a place of, right, like helping them find a new name that fits better, which I think is kind of nice in a way for parents. It might not be nice for the individual, right, who's trying to really find their own way, so it has to always be balanced, right, in terms of what the person's needs are. Of course, it's most respectful to refer to the person by the name they indicate, just as it would be for everyone else. My name is Manda. Everyone calls me Amanda when they first meet me. I always have to correct it because it's going to become awkward over time when you find out that's really not my actual name. It's most respectful to refer to people using their name that they prefer. The other thing, right, is about asking for pronouns. So this was sort of a thing that, Megan was commenting about. Sometimes it's impractical. You're in a retail situation. You're not going to ask every customer type of thing. But for the people that we're working with, we could ask, right, what are your pronouns? And the other thing about this was really fun is that when I go to these trans conferences, everybody wears a name tag, and you put your name, and actually I should have done it today, right? You put your name on your name tag, and then below it you put your pronouns, and everyone does it. Which is kind of an interesting exercise, right? Everyone does it, regardless of what I might think that it's obvious, because I've never, right, because I've been in a privileged position where it rarely gets questioned, if ever. it's interesting for everyone to say it. And then you don't single out people. It's like, oh, just this one non-binary person or just this one trans person is going to be sharing their pronouns. It's like, no, we're all going to do it. And in a way, by doing it, kind of make the statement that it's not something that you can necessarily always know, right, just by looking at a person. And, you know, it might take some practice, right? There's another pronoun thing in a minute. It might take a little bit of practice sometimes to be more neutral in your language with people. You know, it just requires, I think, a little bit of extra thoughtfulness, right? I'm sure, you know, that everybody in this room, it's probably not just me, at least I hope not, like uses words sometimes with some groups of people that you would never use with others, right? Like, you know, when you're speaking to your friends, for example, you might talk differently than if you're speaking to your children or your grandmother, right? Or your priest or whatever. We modify our language all the time given the context that we're in, right? You talk to your clients differently than you're going to talk to a family member. This is just part of that, right? This is just part of that. The trick of this is that it changes something that we've, you know, always felt was unchangeable. But I think, you know, we should give ourselves a little more credit. We can all do this. We do it all the time anyway, especially if you're in a clinical position. And then the other piece of this has to do with our own systems, like in an environment like this, right? It's useful to collect this information in a systemic way so that people don't have to constantly repeat it. And so that staff understand how to refer to people correctly and respectfully, and they don't, you know, if you have a new staff member come in or you have, you know, somebody filling in or whatever, that everybody has that information so that the person doesn't constantly have to say it. In our environments, right, where we're trying to kind of manage a person's experience to some degree, they don't have to constantly repeat it, right? We have a good way of you know, collecting the information. You know, that's something that I think, right, our systems here are limited in terms of our medical record because there are only 2 options for gender, and I've participated in the committee that explored changing that, you know, because of, well, what do you think the answer is? Because of the way VISTA is, you know, it's not that simple. You can't just add extra categories. It actually pulls from Insight, and so you have to change that. It just became a whole rigmarole. My hope is that with our new EMR, there will be rainbows and unicorns, and we'll all get a bucket of money. And then also, it'll allow for a greater number of you know, of options, right, to be able to select so that people can identify themselves. You know, if we don't do that, we miss collecting data on our population.
Yeah, I know there are certain EMRs that actually have because normally it's like, you know, the name and gender and such, and I don't know if they necessarily have, besides the binary for gender, but I know there are also ones that have like a separate subline that actually identify pronouns, like built into it.
Yes. That would be perfect, right? That would be beautiful. And then we would do it for everyone.
Yeah.
And then it wouldn't
It's
be
a part
so
of the
weird
screen.
that we were
Part of the
singling out.
screen,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, that would be beautiful. I'll keep that in mind when we make up that EMR committee. You know, so a lot of people who are non-binary prefer to be referred to with a neutral pronoun like they. I was also a person in the beginning of hearing about they. I was like, I can't do it. Grammatically, my mind will not allow me to do it. But I'm happy to report that it has. So, you know, when people prefer, and this is the definition of they, right? Also used to refer to a person of unspecified gender. So there is a use. There is a use for a neutral version of they. And I think, you know, that just requires us to have to think when we're talking with people. And it's like I said, you know, it's very ingrained in a lot of ways. So I work with a youth who's non-binary who prefers they, which I'm proud to say I can do pretty well now. And but there are all these other words that are gendered. It's very annoying. So I said to the kid one day, and I might have even said this in the last lecture. I said, oh, you know, you'd be an amazing actress. And I was like, no. You wouldn't be an amazing actress. It's like, that's so weird how that happened, right? So, you know, it takes practice, but it's certainly possible. We can all do it. And then there's another example, right? So this is just they are in the waiting room. The doctor is ready to see them. oh, I don't know, do you know someone left their umbrella here? Do you think they'll need it? We can like practice saying they and using it as a singular. It's really fun. And then there are a couple of other, this is an example, right, of another set of pronouns that have been sort of developed for this purpose. Very rarely I see people, I hear people using those pronouns, but it certainly is something that happens, and I think, sort of more deeply in certain communities, right, you might see that more often. Z here and here's. But often, like I said, they and them and theirs are the preferred pronouns, and of course the way to find out is always to ask. So this is the activity. These are examples of buttons that you might see at an event, and I think it's useful to think about, and maybe this is something to do with people that you're working on this with. Creating opportunities to describe what pronouns you use in a way that doesn't make the assumption. Any comments about that? Thoughts?
I was actually laughing at the colors. Because I was thinking, cause like for my kids, my little one would absolutely want the blue. She would want the blue pig. Like, no, I want the blue one. But cause that's she loves blue. And my older one would want the pink one, absolutely.
No matter what it said.
But the little one would want the blue. But it's interesting even how this is like, we're gender neutral, we're going to use all these different pronouns, and it's still defaulted to the pink and blue for him and her.
That's so funny, I didn't even realize that actually. I did not even realize that. And I have one in my office actually, a pin. I have to look and see if it's pink. That would just be so classic if it is. But it just goes to show you the thing. And then of course there's yellow, which is like, why is that a neutral color? I don't understand. It's yellow, why? I hate yellow. Anyway, but these are some of the things, notwithstanding the colors. So do you have a comment?
No.
Anything else about that? Any thoughts about that? Pronouns or using them? Pink and blue, yellow? No. So what are we doing? So ideally, right, we can try to practice avoiding using gender-specific language until we know what people's preferences are. It can be tricky, but it can be done. And you'd be surprised, actually, I think in terms of my own practice with having to think of, it's almost like I'm thinking about what I'm saying before I say it, which I think clinically many of us do in certain ways anyway. It'd be an interesting experience. Go back to your unit today and see what it's like to try to avoid gender-specific language. It's really an interesting challenge. But ideally, right, we're training people to not make those assumptions, right? Staff that we're working with and other people that are coming in contact with the patients we see. Ideally, we're offering like a gender-neutral, all-gender bathroom somewhere. I have a dream of that for here. We'll see how it goes. The other thing, right, is if doing that is not an option, then we just create an openness in terms of allowing people to use whatever restroom they feel most comfortable in. Recognizing that some people don't feel comfortable in either, and that we don't want to make anyone feel uncomfortable in either, right? I mean, everyone has the right to be relieved. If we ask for people's names and pronouns routinely, it's not like we're only singling out people who we can't put in a box, which, is a tendency anyway. So if we ask everybody, we're in a position that, there's no question about why we're asking you. We just ask that to everyone. And then we want that information to be shared with staff and programs that we're working in with the same patients that we see, so that we don't have to, so clients don't have to consistently share that again and again and again, but so that we all know how to refer to people respectfully, right? And I think it's especially important in like a milieu environment, right? Like the day school or inpatient or even CTR. Even the school, I see you always think of that. Even in school settings where you're doing groups, those kinds of things, so that people understand how to refer to people in the group. Oh, here we go. Here's a gender-neutral restroom sign. I don't know what it says in Braille, but I thought that, it was a clever little sign, right? I like this 3 different outfits. But anyway, so that's a gender-neutral bathroom sign. The other thing is that, where you're going to make mistakes, we all make mistakes, that's something that's going to happen. So we just demonstrate our willingness to learn from people, just make a correction. When I said actress, I was like, oh gosh, I'm sorry. I'm surprised that came out of my mouth. And I just corrected myself and the person moved on. I think, we're better off, and I mean, as clinicians, I think we're probably all pretty well versed in this anyway. We're certainly better off apologizing if I make a mistake than pretending like it didn't happen, or becoming defensive about it. And I think, we permit ourselves to be imperfect, so that helps too. Some of us more than others. I think also we want to open up a space, right, that creates an openness for people to even talk about this. Because a lot of times, especially this happens for me in supervision, I'll be working with a clinician who maybe didn't consider aspects of gender or sexuality with a kid, or it's not being addressed at all. And so it's a thing that might be out there in a milieu, right, in the milieu, but it's not something that's happening, there's no conversation happening about it with the clinical team. And the question is, why not? Because the kid is obviously comfortable enough to talk about it in a group with their peers. What's happening? Why not with us? Maybe because we're adults, maybe because kids feel like we don't understand them, maybe because we haven't figured out how to present ourselves in a way that kids will feel comfortable sharing those things with us. I mean, I can tell you when they do, they will. They will share things with you that you like all kids, right, that you will be surprised that they're even thinking about. So I think we want to keep that, that dialogue open. I think, if you don't know what to do with a person in terms of what their needs are, you can provide them with resources, like I provided a few today, and I have a copious other resources if you needed something, or connect them with professionals who do, or, do a little bit of research, right? There's plenty of information out there. And, of course it always makes sense to take cues from people about how to interact with them, and, right, physically, and using language that they feel is comfortable. So those are also things that we would do as a matter of working with people in terms of their comfort. I included this because I think for people who, some non-binary people will engage in particularly this is related to medical intervention, right? So hormone therapy and or other types of gender affirmation surgeries. And this is really still the document that's the most respected in terms of providing guidance for those procedures. I think it's being consistently updated when new information becomes available, right, or new practices come into place. So I would expect an update coming, in the near future that includes the non-binary aspect, because at the moment, it can be hard for people who identify as non-binary to have surgical procedures done because, if they're not transgender, then it's, hard to follow. There's not as clear of a path to follow. But those are available for anyone to read. I highly recommend it. I actually I'm really impressed if I give a teenager this URL and they go and actually read the standards of care. But it's like my little test in a way, like, listen, you have to really, if you can't look at this thing, what you're asking for is going to be like even much bigger than just reading a few pages in a booklet. So, so there may be some application to people who are non-binary. And then the other piece, just to touch upon, is that there are various aspects to transition, right? Generally, for a discussion like this, we're talking about social, legal, and medical. The social piece has to do with coming out and letting people know that there's a preferred name and pronoun to be used. Like comporting oneself in alignment with their gender identity. Managing things like accommodations. What bathroom can I use? For kids in schools, like what locker room can I change in? How can those accommodations be made in a way that doesn't create an undue burden for students? Like, you shouldn't have to go all the way to the nurse's office in your high school to use the restroom. Understanding that, it also would be useful to provide kids with a safe place to change for gym, which I just can't believe they still have to do. Why? Right? Because I think a lot of times kids feel uncomfortable, even if they identify, however they identify, being in the being in the locker room, in a new locker room can be scary, and particularly it depends on which one, right? I think typically the men's locker room is scarier than the women's locker room, for reasons I will never know, or don't want to know, perhaps. So so we have like about but this talk ends at 10:30, so I'm gonna stop at this will be my last one. In addition, right, so for medical interventions, there's this, there are sometimes people who want to have hormone therapy or have other types of procedures done that may or may not be part of a non-binary person's journey, but it may be. And then the other piece related is legal aspects, right? So if you change your name, you want to change your name legally, that requires a variety of steps depending on whether a person's a minor or an adult, basically over 18 or under 18. So for a lot of people, and actually a lot of the kids I see, it goes like this, right? They transition socially first. Most people transition socially first. It makes the most sense. It's the most accessible, right? I don't need I don't need a legal document. I don't need a medical provider to help me socially transition. And then often they go to legal next, right? So I have a kid that I see now who I think in the end is probably non-binary, and I'm really excited that we're coming to that conclusion because this is a kid who a year ago was like, I kind of want hormone therapy, and I was like, I don't okay, I mean, let's talk about it, but then kind of didn't go that direction. But this is a kid who is going through a legal name change, right? So that they have a more neutral first name. Their birth name was a very feminine name. And this was a kid whose mom was very attached to the name that she gave her child. It had a family significance and there were a lot of things connected to it. And this was actually a kid who participated with their mom in kind of coming up with a name that fit, which was great because now the mom uses the name comfortably too. So that works out well. So, there's a whole process that you have to go through to change your name, right? You make a petition to the court, you have to put an ad in the newspaper, indicating your intention to change your name. I guess so anybody can come after you if you owe them money, I don't know. And then you provide proof of that, and then the court will legally allow you to change your name. So, and for minors, that has to be done with their parent, with their parents. The parents make the application, basically. So there are other things that are connected here about transition, but I think we won't go into that because we're talking mainly about the non-binary population today. I guess, does anybody have any questions? Or comments?
Just one thing I could share about the legal stuff, because I know from friends, is that not all judges are particularly supportive about the name change stuff. And so if you're working with a young person or an adult who's going to go through legal name change around regendering their name in some way, just help them be prepared that the judge might be nasty to them.
Yeah, I mean, judges are tough, I think, because they're individuals in our society who have like a disproportionate amount of power in comparison to other people. Yeah. Like frighteningly a little bit. I've heard that too. I mean, I think most of the kids I've worked with or young people I've worked with in New Jersey who have changed their names, I haven't heard many things, but every county has its different sort of socio-cultural political makeup, and every judge comes from a place, right, of their own. So I think it's certainly possible that would happen. I mean, I think it's also good, sometimes, like the kid I'm referring to, I don't think is even going to have to go before the judge themselves. I think sometimes it's, very easy, but also sometimes there's a barrier, and like I said, it depends right on the sort of political makeup of that person too sometimes, which can be concerning.
Change gender markers on birth certificates in New Jersey? Do they need medical documentation?
In New Jersey, you need to have, not
names, gender markers.
Yes, your gender marker. Yeah, you can change your name through this process, but yeah, to change your gender marker, you basically have to have a physician certify that you've completed an adequate level of medical transition. I mean, basically, it's create a scenario where in New Jersey, you can only change your gender marker if you've had, like complete sex reassignment surgery, right, or gender affirmation surgery, which we would call on this side. But that's not common. A lot of people don't end up, going that route. It's a very delicate thing.
Well, kids have a driver's license for 2 to 3 years before they're even eligible for that surgery. Because if you go through the standards of care,
Absolutely.
they have to be living for a year, they have to be in therapy for a year, et cetera, so they can't possibly have that medical support. Meanwhile, they're carrying a driver's license that says male when they present as female.
That's right, and those standards about having a year have relaxed a little bit in terms of the time frame, so it doesn't have to be that long. And the social transition, what used to be required that a person had to live as their identified gender for a year before they were able to be eligible even for surgery, or for medical intervention, mainly for surgery. That's sort of been relaxed in a way, but to your point, that's right. I mean, you can get a driver's license when you're 17, and it could be several years before, but you could be presenting as female, right? Like I work with a young person now who's 14. It's a very unusual scenario. She transitioned socially as a child. She was just a kid who was always saying she was a girl from the very beginning. So in second grade, it was like they were just letting her do what she wanted to do, which was dress, in a feminine way. And it's still true. Now, 7 years later, she still identifies as female. There's not really a question. If you saw her, you wouldn't even realize that, that had been her journey. But she's not going to have bottom sex reassignment surgery. She's a child. Nobody in their right mind would do that. So she's going to get a driver's license that's going to not match even her legal name. It's really problematic. I mean, what really should have happened in New Jersey is what happens in New York, which is that you don't have to. Basically, a physician certifies that you've completed, it's an adequate process, or however the language is. It basically allows for a person to change their gender marker on their birth certificate, regardless of their surgical status. Which I think is probably better. And it's not like it's not like I could just walk in there right now and be like, hey, I want to change my gender marker. You have to provide, right? It's like properly vetted. There's documentation that people provide. But I mean, I worked with a young woman who went to graduate school in New York City. She was a local college student, and she transitioned in college, and presented as female and had that same issue with the driver's license, but fortunately for her, she was born in New York. So like one day, she was able to go take her paperwork and have it changed and then get a driver's license, so that now things are congruent, right? Because that's the other thing, that outs you. If you're out, if I'm in an airport and I give someone my driver's license, airports are like the scariest actually, because they're really like searching you, they're really checking you, making you stand in that thing, very invasive, actually. I mean, for good reasons on that end. But I think, right, people end up feeling like, it's like disrupts their privacy in terms of their identity, right? Because the documents don't match. What else? Other comments, questions, thoughts, opinions?
I'm just curious, based on your experience and research, if you could talk a little bit about the connection with LGBTQ population and having a history of sexual abuse.
I don't think I can. I don't know that there's, I mean, in terms of childhood sexual abuse, or?
Do you see that coming into play?
No, not any more than the general population. I don't think. I mean, that's just an incidental observation. I think it's certainly what a lot of people think.
Right.
Right? I mean, as an out lesbian, I can tell you that people, in my youth, before people knew better than to say something like this to me, there was the idea that like maybe you were gay because you haven't had the right man, or because something bad happened to you because you were abused by men. I mean, I think 1 in 4 women is sexually abused. I always say if every woman who was sexually abused was a gay woman, there'd just be a lot more of us. Right? Because actually, the statistics are pretty staggering, right? 1 in 4 people. I mean, I can say that people in, this is probably, right, almost even goes without saying, people in populations that are marginalized have a greater risk of experiencing abuse and violence directed towards them. So that's certainly true. And although I couldn't possibly pull them up at this moment, there are certainly statistics about that, right? About people, especially transgender people, or people, right, who have a non-traditional gender presentation, right? That people are more likely to be, especially physically assaulted. But that's a sort of a cultural problem, not necessarily an issue of upbringing. That being said, also I think, you can't necessarily ignore a subset of the trans or LGBT youth population who are in families where it's very taboo and who may experience physical abuse or emotional abuse at home in relationship to their identities, you know. And that's actually one of the most, I mean, to me, having family support and, you know, and not having that experience is one of the most protective factors for LGBT youth in general, right? Is having family support in that, you know, in a safe, you know, like holding home environment. But I'll have to check out the rest of that. I'll think about that. Anything else? Any other comments, questions? Everybody have to get back to work? Thanks so much for coming. It was great to see you. I hope you'll come next month.